Okay, everyone, we are going to do it. Top 10 favorite books of 2024. This was a kick-ass year for reading after a slight down year in 2023 in which I had no full 5-star books. I can tell you, the book I have at 7 this year would have been a serious contender for Book of the Year last year. So, I didn't read way more books than I did last year. I think I read about an extra 20. Okay, so quite a few more. But the average quality was much higher, so I can attribute this partially to all the glorious recommendations of the community we are in. So we are also going to give out some book awards as well, because it just seems fun. So I'm going to give out a character of the year, the author of the year, and most improved reread, of which there were 17. So 17 had a chance, but also one of them didn't have a chance, because one of those rereads was Lord of Emperors, which was already at 10 out of 10. So, and one of them was Ship of Magic, which was at 9.9 out of 10. So they didn't have that much room to go up. But anyway, have more of a mix of genre this year than ever before. Halfway in the year, I had read more sci-fi than fantasy. And I think if I look over to my left for my top 10, I know there's 2 missing that I read on ebook. One of them was a Russian classic, and one of them was sci-fi. Then we got a fantasy book that people don't call a fantasy book because it became a classic, but it's a fantasy book. We got a mystery, a sci-fi that's really fantasy, another fantasy. Okay, then there would be the sci-fi that I'm missing, and then an urban fantasy, a sci-fi, and then 2 more that are kind of fantasy. One's kind of contemporary fantasy. So much less epic fantasy than usual. I would describe 2 of these books, 3 of these books as what you'd consider epic fantasy. One's got more of a dark academia vibe. Anyways, without further ado, my number 10 favorite book, and I don't really have that many honorable mentions because there was a decent sized jump, but I'll say number 11 would probably be The Shawshank Redemption by Stephen King, which was the last book I read, which is really good news because previously the only Stephen King book I'd read was The Stand, and I was pretty lukewarm on The Stand. And Kyle and Ben both picked a Stephen King book for my TBR. They picked my January TBR, which will be the next 6 books I'm reading, plus University Book Club books, if I get around to them. So reading another Stephen King book and really enjoying it was a damn good sign. And also, it was a bit embarrassing I hadn't read it since Shawshank's my favorite movie. But coming at number 10, we have a book that really shouldn't have worked for me. On paper, it kind of sounds boring. But it wasn't. And that's Boy's Life by Robert McCammon, which feels like it should be heavily reliant on nostalgia for small town life in the U.S. in the 60s. And I obviously did not 50s. I obviously didn't grow up in the 50s, and I didn't grow up in the U.S., and I didn't grow up in a small town. So I have nostalgia for none of these 3 things. But it's just really compelling. I don't think there's a boring section at all. The book kind of describes the appeal of itself within the book, which was pretty meta. I think Robert McCammon does such a good job of creating a culture of the areas where I feel I don't know of any character in this book. I wouldn't for any of them be that's one of the best characters I read all year. But the character work felt like it was better than the sum of its part. Just looking at how interesting each individual character doesn't do it justice, because it was how they interacted and the sense of community that it had that did such an excellent job of driving the narrative. Just has so much that was extremely relatable. And it also did an excellent job of building tension, and not the fast-paced thriller tension, but the tension of the feel of impending disaster. It maintained that extremely well. So anyway, Boy's Life, I believe I gave it a 9 out of 10. Squeaks in the number 10 spot. And number 9 is a book I don't have physically and was very, very short. It was The Death of Ivan Ilyich, which also sounds pretty boring on paper. Death of Ivan Ilyich, I'm going to pronounce the name of the author wrong, is Leo Tolsky. Same guy who wrote War and Peace. It's about an average dude dying boringly. I'm really giving it a pretty great sales pitch, aren't I? So yeah, that's why it was a 9.1 and not better, because I think it was as good of a book could be about an average dude dying boringly. It really, like, this is one where I read it and I'm like, yeah, so I can see why people have been reading this guy for like 3 centuries, right? Because like, it's just the way it unfurls works so well emotionally. Like, it gives you almost a sense of dread in that, like, this is someone who's dying boringly, like, earlier in life they were expecting to, but it definitely is a book that forces one to confront death, because, like, the emotions that the main character is going through is something that everyone will have to go through at some point or another, like facing the imminent end of your life. And like, I feel like the same thing would have happened had he, lived to the age of 95. It just would have been delayed. And like, what would he actually have accomplished with his life in that extra 40 years? Like, he just wasn't living a fulfilling life at all, despite the appearance of success. And it's really a book that I think makes one consider what a successful life looks like, and forces one to confront the inevitability of death. So that's fun. So yeah, if this book, I guarantee, has caused midlife crisis, at least, like, probably a large amount of people to go into a midlife crisis. I'm a little bit too young to have a midlife crisis, so I dodged it by reading it at the age of 25. But if you're someone who feels like they could be susceptible to a midlife crisis and you don't want that, maybe stay away from this book. If you do want to have a midlife crisis, Death of Ivan Illich, go for it. Coming in at, I think I gave it a 9.1. Coming in at number 8, we have another non-fantasy novel, and another classic, and I'm giving it to And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie. I think I picked this up in a random bookstore in Moab, Utah, which was random. Anyway, I have never really read mysteries to any significant degree, and I figure why not start with one of the most famous ones. I know a couple people who really like this. Kyle gave it a glowing review, and I was like, all right, I tend to like the same stuff as Kyle, so let's give it a try. It was pretty damn awesome. It's Agatha Christie. No, I did not figure out what was going on, obviously. For those who don't know, the premise of this is it follows like a nursery rhyme. There's a rhyme that's on the start of the book. 10 little soldier boys went out to dine. One choked his little self, and then there were 9. 9 little soldier boys sat up very late. One overslept himself, and then there were 8. 8 little soldier boys traveling in Devon. One said he'd stay there, and then there were 7. 7 little soldier boys chopping up sticks. One chopped himself in halves, and then there were 6. 6 little soldier boys playing with a hive. A bumblebee stung one, and then there were 5. 5 little soldier boys going in for law. One got in chancery, and then there were 4. 4 little soldier boys going out to sea. A red herring swallowed one, and then there were 3. 3 little soldier boys walking in the zoo. A big bear hugged one, and then there were 2. 2 little soldier boys sitting in the sun. One got frizzled up, and then there was 1. 1 little soldier boy left all alone. He went and hanged himself, and then there were none. So it's about 10 people being on this little, all get an invitation from a different source, and then they start dying one at a time. And so they're like, crap, one of us is the killer. We have to figure out who. I thought I was cooking halfway through this. I had a theory. I was like, this is totally correct. This is so clever. Nope. Totally wrong. Very, very quickly builds a set of compelling characters, tension, atmosphere. It's Agatha Christie. It's one of the best-selling novels of all time, probably for good reason. So we have a bit of a jump here to 7, where when I read this next book, next book is the first one that would have contended for Book of the Year last year. I don't know if it would have beaten Forest Mage, but it might have been my Book of the Year last year, and I have it at 7. And I read this one pretty early in the year, so when I read it, I was like, this will be a Book of the Year contender. And that's Disquiet Gods by Christopher Ruocchio, who has extended his streak of making top 10 lists. I guess I don't think... So Demon in White made it in 2021, and then Kingdoms of Death 2022, and then There was none in 2020. So anyway, he, I think, has, because he's just releasing very good books very consistently, has the most entries of anyone on these top 10 lists across the years. I think I did, my first one was for 2020, which he didn't make. But then he's made 2021, 2022, and 2024. So he's had 3 entries. This one is, I think, technically the lowest spot he's had, but that's a reflection of how stacked the year is. And, like, the thing is, the previous years that were equally stacked, they were stacked because I read, like, 10 books by one author that were all completely amazing. Like, 2021 was just, like, the year of Hobb, and 2022 was the year of GGK. This year, the brilliance was more spread out among people. So this is my second favorite Sun Eater novel. It's possible it's my favorite on reread. Hadrian is just such an interesting protagonist. He's almost like, he's very old. I don't think it's a spoiler to say, like, right away, like, at the start of Empire of Silence, narrator Hadrian is like, boy, I'm old. And this is book 6. Also, this is a Daniel Green quote on it. By the way, met Daniel at Dragonsteel. Super nice dude. Like, outrageously nice. He had a decently long lineup to get to, like, his booth. And one of the reasons is because a bunch of people wanted to say hi to Daniel. But the other is, like, he wasn't just, like, meeting people, being, like, picture, bye. He was, like, having full-blown conversations with everyone. It's cool that he has a quote on Disquiet Gods. Anyway, really everyone was nice at Dragonsteel. What a great community. So this book was bonkers and had tons of completely insane stuff. I was saying Hadrian is almost like, like the wise wizard dude who's, like, really eccentric and normally, like, the hero has to go to for help. Hadrian has been the hero. He's now the eccentric wise wizard dude. And usually, from the hero's perspective, you're like, why won't this guy just help us? Like, he's so frustrating. But when I see it from Hadrian's perspective, I'm like, yeah, okay, fair enough, bros. Bros earned a bloody break. Why should he help? The end of this book was insane. It has some stuff in it that I think people have interpreted as overly allegorical. I interpreted it as, like, there's definitely stuff here that's inspired by, like, Catholic canon. Ruocchio is a Catholic, for those who don't know. I do not think I think some people have a concern that the end of the series is going to be, like, preachy. I don't think it's going down that route. I will be very disappointed if it does. So yeah, I thought there's a section in the middle that I think had some mixed taste. I thought it was incredible. The world building is wild. Just incredible creativity and the way everything comes together. It's one of the most insane climaxes. It's like this weird mix of Howling Dark and Demon in White. Which they're both awesome. So, like, sick. Really my only complaint for this novel was there's, like, a 40-page section, like, around here where I felt like it spun its tires for a touch. Where I remember there was a podcast about pacing with Ada Palmer and Ken Liu, and I always forget the third person. I'm sorry. Those are the two people on the podcast who I know. I hadn't read any Ada Palmer at the time. And Ada Palmer said sometimes, like, she just asks herself, like, what's the next interesting thing I know that's going to happen? And then, like, why can't that happen right now? And I felt like that was a question I was asking myself for, like, 20 pages in Disquiet Gods. But then the next interesting thing happened, and there was no break for crazy things happening. It was just like, okay, we've had the crazy thing happening, now just constant, incredibly compelling stuff the entire time. So it gets a 9.4 out of 10. Amazing book. Next up, we have a book the second book I have read by an author, which convinced me that this is going to be one of my favorite authors ever. Like, one kick-ass book can be like, all right, you wrote a kick-ass book. 2 kick-ass books is like, you're an auto-buy author now. And that was Blood Over Bright Haven by M.L. Wong. I thought the same author as Sword of Kaigen, obviously. I love Sword of Kaigen. I like this even more. I think... So it's a dark academia. It's very different from Sword of Kaigen. Showed a lot of range, I think, because they both have a really incredibly compelling, flawed strong, badass protagonist who very quickly, like, despite being very flawed, I found myself wholeheartedly rooting for both. And they both have very, very different personalities. And, like, while they're both very strong and flawed and compelling, the things that make them strong are totally different. The things that make them compelling are totally different. And the things that make them flawed are mostly totally different. While reading this book, I could not help but be reminded of Babel, because they were written at nearly the same time, so neither author could have read the other book while they were writing this, and they're both dark academia, and they are similar in a lot of ways. What kept standing out is just how comparatively amazing of a character writer M.L. Wong is. I truly think, like, she's in the top echelon of character writing among fantasy. She gets human psychology and she writes these, like, conflicted characters so incredibly well, and she understands how a character can understand something about the world very deeply, but also, like, be completely oblivious to very similar aspects of the world that you would think they would also get. But it's very, like, believable that they don't. And she just gets the contradictions of humanity. So, and she gets me invested in characters so quick. Like, you feel like you understand the characters incredibly quickly. She has written just, like, 2 top tier protagonists. This one has a smaller supporting cast, but all the supporting characters I think are very well done. There's one antagonist that I think is over the top. That was a reoccurring theme of this year, where, like, there's an extremely hateable antagonist who you just want to punch in the face. And then, like, it's just kind of like, yeah, I get it. Like, he sucks. Like, is this really necessary? Like, we get the point. Yeah, that's, like, the closest thing I have to a criticism. And it's addicting, too. Like, this novel, this was, like, I can't even say what it's about. Because it's like, so the start of the novel, I can say what the start of the novel is about, is about a character named Siona who is trying to get into Wizard University. This has a hard magic system, by the way. If that bothers you, whatever. I don't care. Don't read it then, okay? Like, it's fine. If you don't want to read it with a hard magic system, lots of stuff doesn't have that. This is fantasy, by the way, and it has soft magic. You can read this. Yeah. So she's like a prodigy, and there's a magic university school that only admits men, and they have, like, this kind of program where one woman can apply, like, every decade, and she's the one who gets to apply. And they have it just to, like, prove that they're like, well, this will prove that women can't make it, and she's like, so she feels a lot of pressure because she's like, if I screw this up, this screws it up for everyone. She's a very ambitious main character who and that likes that stuff. I was like, oh, this is really good. 8 point something out of 10. Like, I was like, it's just a very well done novel. There's also a prologue that they call chapter 1. It should just be a prologue. But I think M.L. Wong saw people on Twitter being like, I don't read the prologue. And M.L. Wong's like, fine, I'll just make it chapter 1. Because it's actually really important and good, and you should read it, the first chapter. So doesn't want people to skip it. I say just let the people who skip prologues skip the prologue, and that's their own damn problem. But, whatever. Gives such a sense of stakes so quickly. And I read this in like 2 days. Anyway, we're moving on. Now we are coming to number 5. My 5th favorite book of 2024 was... So this was really close. The rate for 5, 4, and 3. I'll actually say what they all were, because I considered 5 books, because there were 2 authors that doubled up for this spot. So the books I considered... in the order that I read them, was Mere Dance by Louis Bujold, Memory by Louis Bujold, Memory and Dream by Charles DeLint, Seven Surrenders by Ada Palmer, and Perhaps the Stars by Ada Palmer. And I struggled with the order of these quite a bit, and I'm going to talk about all of them. I just gave up the next, 2, but whatever. So at first... Memory, when I originally read it, Memory was my favorite book in the Ruocchio saga. Over time, I've decided I like Mere Dance more. And Mere Dance is my 5th favorite book of 2025. So, I have compared these to Dresden fans. They're kind of like the Changes ghost story of Vorkosigan, except Memory's quite a bit better than Ghost Story. I really like Ghost Story. Don't get me wrong. Ghost Story is awesome. And Memory also has like the higher Goodreads rating, so it's generally like perceived a lot better. Mirror Dance is the insane one. And I think there was like, when you just read something, there's a bias against books that have an incredibly strong first half and then like a very strong but not quite as strong second half, which is how I would describe Mirror Dance. Like, halfway through this book, it was like 9.7 out of 10. Like, it was an absolutely, completely incredible first half of the book. Combination of having a moment that, like, actually I think changed how my perspective on the world, like, it shifted. You know, there's everyone, it's like how much of who people are impacted by like who they are intrinsically, and how much is like the circumstances in which they've lived their life so far. And it shifted my perspective on weighing the circumstances of their life more than I used to before. Like, this changed how I see humanity. And that's an enduring impact, which is what bumped it up to maybe I like this more than, maybe this should have been 4. I don't know. Whatever. Mirror Dance might continue to go up in hindsight. But then I didn't like the second half of the book quite as much as the first. So I think it ended up with a lower rating than it should have at first, because there's the bias of what you just read. But then in hindsight, like, I remember the entire experience. And Louise Bujold, I think, is one of the best character writers that I've ever read. She would be on my Mount Rushmore. She's also one of the best plotters I've ever read. It's actually pretty wild. I think Robin Hobb is the best character writer I've ever read. And for me, it's not that close. I understand lots of people it's going to be like, aren't going to think that. But I just will say in full transparency that when I read Robin Hobb, she feels like an outlier. Among the non-outliers, Louise Bujold might be the best character writer I've ever read. And she might be the best plotter I've ever read. She is one of the only people who I think could actually make a case for being the best plotter and character writer in sci-fi and fantasy. I don't think she is. Like, I don't think she's the best at either. But she is, I think, one of the only people that if someone claimed they're the best at both, I wouldn't think you're crazy. Like, there's a couple people where I'd be like, I see the vision. If someone said George, I'd be like, okay, I see the vision. I think Game of Thrones and Storm of Swords have incredible plotting. Clash of Kings has good plotting. And then, like I feel like George has contended for both, just not at the same time. Well, for one book, for Storm of Swords, I think is some of the best character work and plotting of any book, like fantasy book or sci-fi book or just book. And then I think Game of Thrones is like some of the best plotting book I've read in a fantasy book and very good character work. And then Feast for Crows and Dance have some of the best character work and not some of the best plotting. Someone said about Erickson. I'd get it. I wouldn't have him in contention for first for either, but I'd have him pretty high for both. And I know a lot of people like Erickson just more than I do, so I'd be like, that's not crazy. Someone said for K. Is he? I don't know. Anyway, Bujold, I think, has the least insane case for being the best at plotting and character work that I've ever read. It's wild. Moving on to number 4, we have, as I kind of already said, we have Memory and Dream by Charles DeLint. Fifth Fath, What's Up? He's been trying to get me to read Charles DeLint for a long time and got me to read this first. And I was completely absorbed by like the third line of the book. And then by page 30, I think I'd already cried. This was, to me, like, this is an urban fantasy set in a made-up city called Newford. I've since seen a couple people really hate it, which makes me sad. Because I thought it was genius. I thought it was kind of good at everything. It had, to me, so many, like, character moments that were relatable, not because of the specific character, but just for the general depiction of humanity. It was very emotionally compelling. It set up dual timelines in a way that had me very compelled by both. And then ended up having what I found to be an incredibly thrilling conclusion. So yeah, like, this was just, and I think just line by line writing, I think Charles DeLint is just excellent. Yeah, So I was blown away right away. This one I also think I like the first half for sure more than I like the second half, but that's fine because like the first half I think had me near to tears multiple times and incredibly invested in everything. So yeah, that's number 4. And number 3, I'm going with Perhaps the Stars by Ada Palmer. Seven Surrenders also would have been, it was close between Seven Surrenders and Memory and Dream. I think I would have had Seven Surrenders. I don't know. Ada Palmer's a fucking genius. Like, just straight up, she might be the smartest author that I've read. Like, I don't know if this, like, if every single chapter was completely compelling to the degree that, like, Mirror Dance was. But this is the most impressive book I've read all year. It might be one of the most impressive series I've ever read, ever. I think it might have the best world building I've ever read. Like, it's a near-ish future that's very advanced but restricted to Earth. In a like kind of optimistic, like, if you ask the people, they're like, yeah, it's kind of a utopia, but there's aspects of society that are just kind of like, I don't know about that one. And it, like, I have a review for this series. I think it's one of the best reviews I've done. And it's like she completely reimagined, like, restructured society in a way that's incredibly plausible. And then, like, the downsides and the secondary effects and the consequences and the unforeseen consequences also feel just incredibly plausible. Also, from a storytelling perspective, I think it's also amazing. It had some of the best chapters I read all year. It got me to change my Discord profile, like, status to a quote from it, because I was just like, holy crap, what an emotionally powerful chapter. Like, Ada Palmer takes more risks than every other author on this list. Yeah, that's true. And I mean, for those of you who have read some authors on this list, like, they don't exactly play it safe. Like Ruocchio's not, like, playing it safe. It's not even close. Like, the amount of stuff Ada Palmer does where it's just like you read it and you're like, I didn't know you were allowed to do that. Like, I didn't know you could do that in a book. Like, is that allowed? Apparently it's allowed, because it worked. It was amazing. Really good character writing as well. Like, incredibly unique characters. This is not like a book that's going to be about, like, the everyman. Like, you're not going to get, like, a Fitz character who's like, oh, what a, like, relatable character that, like, I can truly see myself in. This is like a larger than life, completely unique characters who still manage to be extremely compelling from an intellectual and emotional standpoint. It's got a completely unhinged, unreliable narrator for the entire series. His name is Mycroft. He's insane. Like, he's just crazy. But, such a strong character voice, and is an incredibly compelling character. What is, like, when I mentioned I'm going to give an award for character of the year, he's gonna be one of the people I considered. Yeah, it is outrageous how thin this book was. This is like a 330,000 word book. Anyway, I've complained about that too much. Perhaps the Stars is brilliant, and Terra Ignota is one of the best series I've ever read. And I think, as much as I enjoy it, I think in terms of impressiveness, it's like even higher than my enjoyment. Yeah. Okay, number 2. So, in the middle of the year, I posted a poll 10 months ago, actually. So not in the middle of the year, near the start of the year. I said, what do you think is more likely to be my personal favorite book I read in 2024? And the options were Wind and Truth, literally any other book, or a specific other book. And there were some guesses for specific other book. Colton guessed Boy's Life. Someone I don't know guessed Ulysses, and I was like, I'm not gonna read it, so that was unlikely. But who knows? Maybe if I had it, would have been my favorite. Someone guessed R. Scott Baker's Prince of Nothing, which I read 2 books from. Really liked Darkness to Come Before. It would be like an honorable mention for this, but definitely wasn't one of my favorite books of all time. Margaret guessed an Autumn War. Really liked Autumn War. Wouldn't have made quite like favorite books of all time. Oh, did I read Betrayal in Winter this year? Betrayal in Winter would be like 11. Anyway, the results were 66% of you guessed Wind and Truth, 31% of you guessed literally any other book, and 3% guessed a specific other book and commented below. And I guess 31% of you were right. Because coming in at number 2 is Wind and Truth by Brandon Sanderson, which did not disappoint at all. And this had a high standard to not disappoint, because like if this was my 8th favorite book of the year, that would be one of the most disappointing things I've read. You can probably guess by the icon. That's Zeth. I was pretty excited for Wind and Truth. I am a fan of the Stormlight Archive. If you're watching this, the last video I uploaded was my Wind and Truth review. And this did not disappoint at all. It's like, it was insane. It was Sanderson's most ambitious book for sure. I've seen people be like, it's too long. I'm slightly confused by this. I feel it objectively has the most content of any Stormlight book by a fairly wide margin. And like, it's the biggest Stormlight book, but I feel like it has the most content per page by a fairly wide margin. And just has so many completely incredible moments. I think Sanderson just gets what makes stories work to a degree that is hard to overstate. Anyway, Wind and Truth was fucking crazy. And like, for characters that I wasn't expecting to be my favorite, I think like Sanderson's biggest strength from a character perspective is when he's had a character who's existed before, and now he's really shining a light on them and making them like one of the more central characters. Because I think, to me, the strongest characters in this book are people who were prevalent characters in previous books, but weren't the main focus, and were the main focus in this. And then, like, the Sanderlanche had so much insane stuff, it was hard to process. Yeah. So anyway, it was pretty comfortable, number 2. Like, I think for the part we got in the pre-release section was reasonably comfortably the weakest section of the novel. And after those 2, I was already like, yeah, this is a Book of the Year contender. And then everything else I thought was better. So, wasn't enough for 1, though. We have an unexpected pick for 1. This would have been, if one of you had called this in that comment, I would have been very, very surprised. Or like I had my 5-star prediction video at the start of the year. My Book of the Year is someone who has had a book on one of my top 10 lists before at the end of the year. But I think it squeaked in. I think it was like middle of the pack. And it is a YA contemporary fantasy novel that's like probably a YA contemporary fantasy novella. And it's A Monster Calls by Patrick Ness. So that was unexpected. So this was hard to compare to the previous 2, because very obviously, in terms of scope, it doesn't compare. Like, Wind and Truth is completely insane in terms of scope, and perhaps The Stars is maybe more insane in terms of scope. And this has like 5 named characters in it. And it's, I don't even want to tell you the premise, because I feel like if, like, not knowing the guy going in blind made it more impactful. I can say that this is, like, you know, when I say a book made me cry, usually it means, like, you know, I teared up a little bit. This is the first book since Assassin's Fate that properly made me cry. Like, you know, when I say a book made me cry, usually it means, like, you know, I teared up a little bit. This is the first book since Assassin's Fate. Narrator Jake here. The me who was recording this forgot about chapter 11 of A Brightness Long Ago. And also a section near the end of Speaking Bones by Ken Liu. That properly made me cry. Like, if you saw, like, if I was reading this in public, it'd be like, everyone would be like, holy crap, why is this person crying? Thankfully I wasn't reading it in public. And also, like, for those of you who have read this book, I just want to say, I finished this book at exactly 12:07 a.m. And, like, if you forget, there's a relevant time in the book. That's the time in the book. An insane coincidence that made, like, the final chapters hit. Like, this was also... Patrick Ness, I think, understands that, like, just misery isn't emotionally impactful. Like, misery, like, pain and hope, the combination in equally strong... Like, all three of these people get this. Everyone on this list, I think, gets this. Like, the books that were just... Like, the saddest books are not the books where just horrible things happen the entire time. Like, you just emotionally, like, shield yourself. You're just like, whatever. Like, way more horrible things have happened in a lot of books, and I'm just like, whatever. Like, I guess that sucks. This had, like, the quadruple whammy. Like, the 1, 2, 3, 4 punch of incredible emotional impact. This is, I think, an emotionally healing book. Like, I would recommend this book to pretty much anyone. I think, like, this is a book we should give people to read and could be helpful for people with processing, like, grief and confronting guilt over how you feel about your own emotions. And, like, really confronting that, I think, like, an emotion that a lot of people would feel, and a lot of people would feel shame about how they felt in this circumstance, and, like, truly confronting that in a way that's not just telling you to get over it, but shows you. And, like, the use of the fantasy element is so good, where this is a book where it's not, like, you can read this book and interpret it as there was no fantasy in it. Like, you can take it literally or metaphorically and be not wrong either way. I choose to interpret it literally. I like it more literally. But if you read this book and think a lot of the fantasy elements are purely metaphorical, like, that's totally fine, man. This edition also is gorgeous. It's got, like, a bunch of art. So it's actually, it's like 200 pages, but in a normal book, I think it'd be like 90. It's truly absurdly good, and I think you should read it. So that's the top 10. Should I just do a separate video for the awards? Yeah, let's do that. Okay, everyone. I will give out some honorable mentions really quickly. The books that almost made the top 10, as I mentioned already, were A Betrayal in Winter by Daniel Abraham, which was my favorite of the Long Price Quartet. I quite liked An Autumn War as well, and I quite liked Price of Spring. I think the antagonist in Betrayal in Winter was the most compelling by a reasonably wide margin. So that almost made the list, even though I forgot about it. And Shawshank Redemption, which I already talked about. And then also an obvious honorable mention to Memory by Louis Bujold. I have heard people say that nothing happens in this book, but it's still amazing. I think half of that sentence is true, because I actually think it's extremely well-paced and reasonably eventful. Those events just don't involve any explosions. Well, actually, there are kind of explosions. They just happen very early. And just incredible attention to details for plotting, like, and character work. And I used it as my stopping point in Vorkoskin. I'm going to continue, but it left it in such a good place. And Seven Surrenders by Ada Palmer, which is book 2. And when I read it, I was like, I think this is the best sci-fi novel I've ever read. And then it got passed by Perhaps the Stars like a couple weeks later or something. However long the gap was between me reading those, probably more than that, probably like a couple months. The density of interesting stuff is so insanely high. Anyway, that's it for the top 10. Let me know what you thought of these books. Any big surprises? Any books you were expecting to see here that weren't? Have a good day, everyone.